Franco, thank you so much for taking the time to have a coffee with the editor with me. Last week, we published your article, Logistics Gateway and Transportation Corridors, a Formula for Success in Africa. And obviously, intermodal rail is part of the new modal creates a win-win solution for governments and the private sector. I think just take my readers who don't really have a concept of what that means through your thoughts.
Yes. So here's really what's important to understand, that in order to create jobs, one has to create an impact, one has to achieve a competitive environment. And the creation of this competitive environment, part of the formula is intermodal rail. So you ask yourself, how developed is intermodal rail in, let's call it sub-equatorial Africa? And why are we not achieving the benefits, for example, that should accrue from customs arrangements, customs accords, and multiple programs that we have for Africa? Part of the solution is that, unfortunately, we are handicapped by what I would consider a thought process which is a legacy thought process. A legacy thought process means a thought process which is a function of inherited ways of doing business. And this is not just an African or South African or sub-Saharan African concept. We have exactly the same problem in terms of countries such as Canada, countries such as Australia, even countries such as the United States. The reason for that is that we were trained as engineers to think on an incremental basis. We were always taught to move forward ahead, building on what is tried and proven from the past. The world, however, has changed significantly and dramatically in many ways in terms of globalization and international competition. Therefore, to be competitive, you have to take the thought process well beyond what I would call the traditional or legacy mindset. And rail was always considered as rail. So to give you an example, in the mid-'80s, a large U.S. rail company, Union Pacific, called me in and said to me, listen, Franco, we really need your help. And we want to create a capability which is, let's use the word multimodal, in terms of moving freight by sea, air, land, and by air, of course, as well. And I said, but you're a rail company. And they said to me, the future is not to think of the mode, but to think of the level of service and the cost. And one may have to switch from one level of service and one type of service to another as part of an integrated process. This was in the mid-'80s. So that was an initial basis. And then I'm going to come to the transportation corridors side. As we globalized and there was more and more movement of freight, we started trying to optimize how we could move freight from, let's call it, the manufacturer to the end user. And this was using the different modes. But what was particularly interesting to me and relates to Africa is NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which is the tying together of three major countries in North America. So we have Mexico, the United States, and we have Canada. The NAFTA agreement I can just keep on talking. Tell me when you want me to stop.
No, carry on.
I'll just finish off this thought process. The NAFTA agreement, basically, which was very controversial because the unions in the United States said all work would flow to Mexico because it was a low-cost labor location and we didn't have the same union restrictions. The Canadians had their own concerns and concepts. But in fact, NAFTA has been a tremendous boon in terms of manufacturing and to a level of reshoring. So reshoring, in fact, is part of what I'm talking about. And when I talk about reshoring, I talk about reshoring to Africa, bringing back to Africa manufacturing. And if you do an analysis, we'll find in the last 5-10 years, our manufacturing capability in sub-equatorial Africa, in the countries of sub-equatorial Africa, has reduced from a figure between 10 and 40 or 50%. So we've lost jobs which existed in manufacturing in Africa significantly, and most of this, of course, has gone to China in terms of Chinese exports. So I'm going to finish off and then I'll let you speak.
That's
So
fine.
what happened is we started developing the concept of how do we move goods from, let's say, Mexico to the United States on a very efficient manner, addressing all of the issues, including customs and security. Security and customs. You know, when we think of, as South Africans, of our problems, I hate to tell you, but our problems are very common to the rest of the world. Problems in terms of security, problems in terms of customs. All of these problems. I'm going to give you a crazy example. When I worked in China, we developed a new language in logistics because everybody thinks, well, they all speak Chinese, don't they? They all speak Mandarin. Well, not true. As you move into inland China, you will find that the same ideogram or symbol does not have the same meaning. So we had to actually create a logistics fanagalo. Okay. So the challenges we have in Africa are not dissimilar to those that are found in other parts of the country, as much as we think we're the only ones carrying that yoke. This brought in the ability of moving freight and product to and from, let's call it Mexico, to the United States and reverse. Block train concept and land bridges were then developed in a means where intermodal freight could be used instead of trucking, could be used to address this requirement and this need. What I see happening is utilizing NAFTA-type concepts, the tying together of sub-equatorial countries with South Africa, and let's make South Africa the US, higher costs, more sophisticated, more developed infrastructure, and then let's go into Mexico, and we can go into Canada, but let's use Mexico as a good example. I did a lot of work in Mexico, still working there, and one of my clients said to me, you know, there's a strong parallel between Mexico and South Africa, and I thought about that, but the interesting thing is that these concepts of land bridges well developed as a result of trying to create trade on the same continent. And this is what I would see happening in Africa. If we could get the same benefits that have accrued to the NAFTA type project to recreating manufacturing jobs in, let's call it sub-equatorial Africa, with South Africa and the other countries tied together with an efficient intermodal network. This is really what I'm saying. Go ahead.
Okay, well, that's a good breakdown because, you know, specifically my background is rail, and I obviously want to move everything possible off-road and onto rail. Not everything is rail friendly, but, you know, I'm obviously very pro-rail. But some of the things in your article really stood out for me. So, firstly, with the decline in global demand, I really do believe that this is probably the best time to be rethinking how this puzzle comes together before demand starts, you know, improving and increasing to the levels pre-COVID-19. That's the first thing. And then the second thing that stood out for me was you quote a figure in China that mentions 76% of their freight still goes on road, despite having invested in significant railway infrastructure.
So let me answer your questions. I'm going to reverse into this. When we look at rail, we can look at rail on, I've worked in rail in most continents, but let's look at the United States, then let's look at Europe, and then let's look at China, and I've worked in all three. So the United States passenger rail is the poorer cousin who's given very little attention. In fact, the big rail companies, which compete with one another, really are the prime focus. The moving of freight by rail, including intermodal, is their prime focus. Also, they have to compete with each other. So basically what you will find is clients who are looking for a site to create a large industrial complex will want rail by at least two rail suppliers. They will not just go to one where they are tied to, for example, BNSF or KCS or whoever it is. Therefore, and also the distances and the geography of the United States is a lot closer to an African geography in terms of long distances, in terms of the movement from logistics gateways and so on. When we come to Europe, and I worked in Europe, and actually, I think I mentioned it in the article, I worked on using of high-speed train for movement of express freight. The focus is the complete reverse. The focus is a passenger focus. And for numerous reasons, density of population, geography, and so on and so forth. And the poorer cousin is freight rail. And so the technologies and the approach and the thought process is driven very much by giving more importance to, let's call it, the passenger. Then we come to China. And China, again, did this reverse in terms of going into high-speed rail, very quickly into high-speed rail. And while they do have initiatives in terms of using rail, and funnily enough, I worked with, believe it or not, DHL years ago, in terms of the basically moving by rail from China to Europe, which is happening today as part of an intermodal function. Rail, in terms of freight rail, did not gain the same prominence as the movement of passengers in, in China. So then you say to yourself, when we as South Africans look at the solutions that we need to implement for rail to be competitive, which is the model that we should be looking at? And in effect, the closest model is driven by the United States in terms of levels of efficiency and intermodal rail. Intermodal rail in the United States has developed significantly, and for a number of reasons. And for example, one of the largest movers of intermodal freight was UPS. UPS is an integrator, basically a package or a mover of packages or lightweight parcels. So in South Africa, for us to be competitive on a worldwide basis, because when you talk of competitiveness, you have to be globally competitive in terms of your overall solution. Intermodal rail is very much part of that solution, particularly if you're moving freight over longer distances. You have to think outside of the traditional or legacy box, and we tend to go back to the legacy box. And I'm going to give you quickly an example of the legacy box. As you know, I work in different modes, sea, air, land. I was asked by a major client in China who had a major airport to design a logistics park. And he said, I've just fired one of the largest consulting companies in the world, and I'd like you to come in and do this logistics park. So I said, my God, I said, how do I do better than these guys? So I listened to him, and then finally I said, logistics park, now tell me, in your mind, in your vision, what do you see in this logistics park? And he started off and said to me, I see a golf course. You see a golf course? He said, yes, I see a golf course. Then I see a hotel. And then I see a convention center. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, listen, if you're going to replicate what is being done in America, I will never win the day. I have to leapfrog the competition. In my mind, what I need to create is whatever you need without going into China. You can land at this location, go to my logistics park, have the product prototyped, and then you can leave knowing that you have an order in place for this particular product. But the big keyword was leapfrogging. He says, if you're just going to give me what is the best that you're doing in the United States, well, great, but I don't want to be the best like the United States. I want to be better than the United States. In a way, I think in South Africa, we have now to do a little bit of a leapfrog, because if we continue incrementally building on traditional concepts and ideas, we're never going to get there. So does that answer part of your question?
It does, absolutely. So, you also talk about transportation corridors. In your article, you refer to the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network, and there is an opportunity for Africa, and certainly with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, where we're trying to connect the continent, for us to actually be, in terms of reshoring and becoming the manufacturing and exporting to a large degree. So how do you envisage the perfect place right now?
So what I would see is a constellation of inland ports tied together by intermodal rail. Twinned operations. In other words, you have a harmonized, system in terms of the movement of freight, providing levels of security and service, which are beyond what you have today. And you also have to look at an improved utilization of assets. Now, I was listening to the other coffee or tea with you with Ralph Mills. So
Okay.
he said, what we have at Transnet is these enormous training facilities where we have all these apprentices and we're teaching them all these basic skills. And he said, and maybe they shouldn't be just looking at trains. So let me give you an example of what just listening to him.
Mm.
So we have to create these constellation of, let's call it Tambo Springs. We're trying to develop this Tambo Springs project south of Joburg.
Yeah.
We're creating these many Tambo Springs all tied together, Tambo Springs, as part of an intermodal network, smart and secure intermodal network.
Yes.
What is important is that adjoining the rail function, you have to create a zone in which you manufacture and distribute product efficiently. Now, what you would take this thought process one step further, what you need to create is incubators where you are manufacturing, processing, or doing things at a higher level or an improved level. I would see Transnet's role, now this, you see how I think out of the box, Transnet's role in creating incubators in these inland ports to basically act as a catalyst for manufacturing in sub-equatorial Africa. Because here we have this large number of apprentices, qualified people who are working at a higher level than a lot of the other emerging African countries. Mm. And what you have to do when you're thinking of exports or moving product between countries is you have to reach the same level of, let's call it, both efficiency and standards. So you're creating a network of catalyst locations where manufacturing is being reintroduced into Africa, both serving African countries and exporting to other countries. I don't see any reason why I should be, crazy example, importing a kettle from China when in my mother's times the kettles were made in South Africa. Now, a kettle technology for a kettle is no big deal. I'm sure that we could manufacture 10 kettles in sub-Saharan Africa or sub-equatorial Africa just as well as they are being manufactured in China and move them to South Africa as a market, for example, or even re-exporting them to other parts of the world. But what I see is Transnet's role should not just be a traditional legacy type role. And as Ralph Mills said, he says, I'm looking at other ways to better utilize this asset, and his one asset as an engineering asset is the ability to manufacture efficiently.
All right, so in your article, you also talk about the Tambo Springs Logistics Gateway. It's had some, I don't know, good press, bad press. I'm not quite sure.
Here's the problem. Projects of that type, which are pretty revolutionary in terms of thought process as well. So Tambo Springs, if you were to bring in any international entity who looks at competitiveness, he would look at the formula and say, this is world-class. He said, this is a world-class formula. At the same time, you're taking this world-class formula and you're having to introduce it into a legacy environment. And this is difficult. Traditionally, projects of this type have a period, they take approximately 5 years to come to fruition. And we are at a 7-year level, 6-year level right now in South Africa. I think that the evolution of Transnet, which of course has also happened lately, will contribute to springboarding this type of project. And I believe that this type of project could become a prototype for exactly what I just said in terms of creating a constellation of inland ports of a smaller magnitude than Tambo Springs. But I believe that moving from the legacy thought process, which has been difficult, in effect, allows such a project to take place. And I believe that things are actually moving after a hiatus of some period of time. I think things are actually moving. You know, when you do these projects, you need to have patience and resilience. And I'm talking worldwide. Patience and resilience. I mean, I did Interpuerto in Mexico, and that was a 5-year process. It's an inland port in Monterrey, Mexico. It was a 5-year process. I'm actually working in another project in Monterrey. Same client called me again, which I was quite amazed by. But anyways, resilience, patience, and then the fact that you are at times swimming against the current. You know, there's no two ways about it.
Silver bullet. So right now we're looking at aside from COVID, we're looking at an environment in South Africa and obviously on the African continent where we're talking about intermodal, we're talking about investing in rail infrastructure. And I know you've said patience and some resilience, but what really is stopping us from getting this ball going?
I think it's the legacy mindset. You know, it's very interesting. In other countries I work with, and they call them crown properties. Crown properties because anybody who was within the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, and so on, we had state-owned enterprises that were inherited from government, and some of them had been privatized. But it's very much an approach and a mindset which has to be changed. Now, in terms of just pure rail, now, you know, I go well beyond the rail in terms of thought process. But if you look at pure rail, you could look at somebody like Hunter Harrison, who wrote this, who turned around two major North American railroads. And he goes into all the key operating measures that have to be defined in terms of having a competitive rail operation. He worked with UP and he worked with CN. He wrote this book, Running a Precision Railroad, which is interesting because he actually gave this book to all of his employees to read. And it told them, this is the way that I see it. We're going to turn it around and create a competitive environment. So from the rail side, adopting these, let's call it, techniques, which are not a big deal. I mean, if you really look at his book, he talks about a number of things. One is service levels, the other one is productivity, and then finally he comes to safety. And then he addresses how these all need to be addressed. But it all comes back to the issue of asset utilization. The way that you look at your problem will very much define your solution. And the legacy mindset constrains you because you tend to look backwards. You tend to look at backwards and you look a little bit incrementally, but you don't look outside of your box.
Yes.
And this was the thing. So you said to me, I love rail. Well, I hate to tell you, there is no such thing as rail. Rail is part of a process. And this process includes rail, and rail is very important, particularly over the longer distances,
Yes.
as long as you provide the levels of service. But you have to think outside of your box. And in terms of pure rail, you take Hunter Harrison's book, you read his book and say, well, this all makes sense. Well, why aren't we doing it? Well, mindset. Can I give you an example?
Sure.
An intermodal, let's call it location. They don't have yards adjoining them where you basically put together or assemble trains. In terms of the land bridge concept, it's point-to-point movement of a unit or a block train. In other words, we don't assemble, disassemble. And you look at even the more recent projects that we've done in South Africa, we have these marshalling yards, and I'm saying to myself, but what is that for? And yes, marshalling yards are required in terms of particular types of freight movement. But if you've got a land bridge concept, the marshalling yard is not really an important element. Also, you're looking at asset utilization. And in terms of asset utilization, you have to realize that are we investing in something which has very little use in terms of what we're trying to achieve? So I think it's a mindset thing. You know, when I did my master's in sort of an MBA in the School of Engineering at UCT some years ago, part of our course was industrial psychology. And it's very sad because I think that we've moved away from an engineering focus, but industrial psychology was very much part of our focus. And that your attitude and your approach is important. The other thing is that most interesting is a lot of the solutions come from the front line. In other words, if you were to look at the work I've done, and I've worked in every continent except for Antarctica, where do my solutions, where my answers come from? I'll tell you what, a lot of what I say and a lot of the work that I've done in terms of creating a competitive environment come to listening to the front line. And I deal a lot with the front line and listening to the front line. It's not always that they're not always 100%, but they give you some pearls of wisdom in terms of doing things. And instead of taking things to a higher level where computerization is thought of as the only way to resolve all problems, in effect, there's a lot of KISS concepts in terms of keeping it simple, stupid, which allow you to become a lot more efficient without going into very complicated, of course, the big word today is blockchain, which, by the way, these concepts were used by Federal Express in the mid-'80s. So we sort of discovered blockchain with a new name, but the technology that FedEx used and then was adopted by UPS and others, very much their own blockchain, if you understand what I mean.
Yes.
So maybe that's those are some thoughts in terms of how to do it. We can do it. It's not a big deal. It's a mindset issue. And in terms of mindset issue, we should be thinking a little bit outside of the box and a little bit outside of the traditional approaches and thought processes. The holy cow, oh, well, this is a holy cow. We must have a classification yard. Well, why? Well, we've always had a classification yard. Well, why the shit do I need one in the next 10 years if I'm going to be moving to a completely different way of moving freight and intermodal freight? So I'm going to give another crazy example. So you look at all these studies done in South Africa in terms of intermodal freight, and everybody talks about pallets, movement of pallets. Well, generally pallets are not high value added goods. So if you were to look at UPS and the movement of intermodal freights, they're moving packages. They're not moving pallets. But the thought process always goes back, well, what are we moving today? Well, we're moving lots of pallets. And there's where it all goes wrong. It goes wrong is that you go back to using a traditional model, while in fact you should be looking at a new model. Even the projections in terms of volumes. I've worked in South Africa for many years in terms of transportation, even was involved in the creation of the Dubai trade port. People go back and they get a study done. They said, well, the movement of freight today is X. So, well, if we can be positive, maybe there's going to be an increment of 6% or 10% of freight. Oh, it's not cost justifiable. But what are we looking at? We're looking at an existing model. No, there's a big mistake. You've got to create a new model and a new market that you're going to capture, which a lot of it is going to be the truck market. Yeah. And that should be on what you are projecting the feasibility of your, let's call it, your venture or your initiative.
So my last question for you is, what are your thoughts on the volumes between road and rail and the ability for rail to recover some of those volumes and the efficiency that may, or competitiveness that may be brought upon by open access to the network?
Open access to the network is a big deal. So let me give you, some years ago, in the times of Alec Irwin, they were thinking of privatizing the ports, and they were thinking, and I worked with CSX, a big US company that had both ports and rail. And CSX said, for us to, what we call it, really do this properly, we need to both have the privatization of the container terminal in Durban, and we should look at City Deep. In those days, it was City Deep. And then we should consider the NATCOR line. So they said, we have to look at this thing in its entirety. I then had meetings many years ago. I don't know what the name was in those days. It wasn't Freight Rail. The name changed a couple of times. And was at the Carlton Center where their headquarters was. And the guy said to me, what you're talking is, you want to create the blue train of freight. And they said, that's a good idea. We have a blue train for passengers, and we could have a blue train of freight. What I'm actually saying is that the thought and the concept has been there for years. And the fact that it was a good way of addressing the problem was even appreciated by the Transnet of then, which was, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But what I'm saying is we need to go back to recreating the blue trains of freight on dedicated lines. Then everybody says to you, well, it's NATCOR. And you go, okay, well, let's think of today's world. What are the characteristics of NATCOR? And the first thing they do is they say, well, look, the distance from Durban to Gauteng and so on, and the difference from Cape Town and so on, and the distance from PE and Kura and so on. And then you say, it's okay. Well, what really are the characteristics we're looking at in terms of the gradients, in terms of the curves, in terms of the possibility of double stacking and all these things. So you can't keep on going back to this, playing the same old tune, because in effect, the NATCOR corridor, unfortunately, has not got all the criteria, does not have all the criteria to be 100% successful or come up with a solution which is necessarily the best solution. So I think that reopening the idea of having blue trains of freight, which is basically creating privatized rail operations using infrastructure provided by Transnet, is an excellent idea, which was well accepted by Transnet 12 years ago. It was just a function of going back to the legacy concept and not thinking outside of the box. I think that is an excellent way of doing it. And as you all know, I always plug the Eastern Transportation Corridor, probably because I was born in Newtonig. But there are other ways and other places in which you can create these corridors using the blue train of freight, where possibly in the future you could double stack, where you're using deep water capability which already exists. And it takes a passenger train theoretically from PE to Joburg is 18 hours.
Yes.
The travel time. 18 hours is achievable today. So I don't have to go and sit, thinking for my container sitting in Durban Harbour for 3 days before I can even get it onto a train. If I was using some of our newer infrastructure in terms of ports and then moving freight using a new corridor, then possibly I would be creating a much more competitive environment for intermodal rail.
Okay, that was very nicely explained. Thank you. And I think we've covered all the points in your article, actually.
Well, thank you, Philippa. It's great. As you can see, I could talk about this for hours, but I gave you, hopefully, an abridged version. But my training came from University of Cape Town and then working in South Africa and then all over the world. And my goal is to pay it forward. If I can bring some of the expertise and knowledge I've developed working all over the world for the betterment of our country, it's important.